Hey guys, tonight we begin with something ancient people feared more than invading armies, more than enemy kings, and sometimes even more than death itself. Nature behaving strangely. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys through history. And tell me down below where you are listening from and what time it is for you, because it is always fascinating seeing these stories travel across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan create that quiet background hum, and let us slowly drift backward together into ancient Egypt. Imagine standing beside the Nile nearly 3,500 years ago. The sun rises over the river exactly as it did yesterday and exactly as people expect it to tomorrow. Farmers are already moving toward the fields. Boats drift quietly over the water. Merchants begin setting up for another ordinary day. Children run along dusty roads while workers carry baskets toward construction sites. Everything appears calm because Egypt depended on routine. Routine meant survival. The Nile flooded, crops grew, food appeared, and life continued. That rhythm had lasted for centuries, and people believed it would continue forever. But civilizations become comfortable in dangerous ways. Human beings quickly assume that what happened yesterday will happen tomorrow. Rivers will flow. Seasons will arrive. Birds will return. The sun will rise. We rarely think about what happens if something decides not to cooperate. Ancient Egyptians trusted the Nile completely because the Nile was not merely a river. It was life itself. Every crop depended on it. Every village depended on it. Every meal depended on it. Remove the Nile and Egypt would stop being Egypt almost immediately. So now imagine something strange beginning to happen. Not dramatic at first, not rivers turning red overnight or skies splitting open. Real disasters rarely begin dramatically. They begin quietly. A fisherman notices fewer fish than usual. A farmer notices an odd smell near the water. Someone standing at the riverbank notices an unusual color beneath the surface. Maybe they shrug and continue working because strange things happen sometimes. Maybe they assume tomorrow will be normal again. But tomorrow arrives and the river looks worse. Dead fish begin appearing near the shore. More of them every hour. The water carries an odor nobody remembers before. People gather near the banks looking confused because rivers are not supposed to look sick. The Nile especially is not supposed to look sick. Priests arrive. Officials arrive. Ordinary people stand watching silently. Nobody understands what they are seeing because nobody possesses laboratories or microscopes or environmental science. Ancient people only have experience and instinct, and experience is now failing them. Then rumors begin spreading because rumors always move faster than facts. One village claims the gods are angry. Another says the river spirits have become disturbed. Someone swears they saw strange signs in the sky the previous night. Another person remembers unusual weather weeks earlier. Suddenly, everyone has explanations because human beings dislike uncertainty. We would rather have frightening answers than no answers at all. Days pass, and the river continues changing. Fish die in greater numbers. Water becomes difficult to drink. Animals avoid certain areas. The familiar world begins feeling unfamiliar, and that might be one of the most unsettling feelings imaginable. Ancient people understood floods and droughts. They understood storms, but a river changing into something unrecognizable felt different. It felt personal somehow, as though nature itself had begun breaking rules nobody thought could break. Then something else happens. Creatures begin leaving the water. Frogs, hundreds at first, then thousands, then so many that people stop counting because counting becomes pointless. They appear beside houses, roads, fields, storage buildings. Children who might have laughed at first stop laughing eventually because frogs continue appearing. People wake up finding them outside doors and inside homes. Farmers walk through fields where frogs leap in every direction. Imagine trying to sleep while hearing endless movement outside. Imagine waking and realizing there are even more today than yesterday. The river that supported life has begun pushing life away from itself. Nobody understands why. Fear begins growing slowly because strange events become more frightening when they continue. One unusual day feels survivable. Multiple unusual days begin feeling like patterns, and human beings become nervous around patterns they cannot explain. Priests conduct rituals. People make offerings. Families whisper together at night. They wonder what comes next because deep down, everyone understands something important. Nature almost never breaks, just once. Problems create more problems. One imbalance creates another. The river becomes strange. Then animals behave strangely. And suddenly, people begin wondering whether the world itself has started slipping out of place. And perhaps that feeling was the most terrifying part of all. Not knowing what disaster had arrived, but knowing somehow that it had only just begun. Begins as the strange events stop feeling like isolated incidents and start feeling like something much worse. A chain reaction that nobody in ancient Egypt could understand and nobody could stop. Days after the frogs had spread across roads, homes, courtyards, and fields, another problem quietly emerged. The frogs started dying. At first, it was only a few here and there, near riverbanks and irrigation canals. People barely noticed. But then the number increased. Small groups became piles. Piles became mounds. And suddenly, entire stretches of land carried the smell of decay beneath the hot Egyptian sun. Ancient Egypt was beautiful in many ways, but it was also warm, crowded, and heavily dependent on natural cycles staying balanced. Dead animals in large numbers were not simply unpleasant. They were dangerous. The heat accelerated everything. The smell spread through villages and cities. Workers walking to fields covered their faces with cloth. Merchants standing in crowded market areas complained that the air itself felt heavy. Families shut windows. Priests burned incense. But there are certain problems incense cannot solve. Because nature has its own cleanup system, and that system was now arriving in enormous numbers. Insects began appearing everywhere. Tiny insects first. Small biting creatures that gathered around people and animals, crawling onto skin, collecting around eyes, gathering in clouds over water and fields. Farmers working outside slapped constantly at their faces and arms. Animals grew restless. Horses shook their heads endlessly. Cattle stamped at the ground trying to escape irritation that seemed impossible to escape. Then came flies, huge swarms moving like dark clouds through villages and streets. Ancient people had no understanding of bacteria or infection. They could not see microscopic organisms moving from place to place. All they understood was that the air itself suddenly felt alive. People could hear the insects before seeing them. A distant humming sound growing louder until entire spaces seemed to vibrate with movement. Imagine eating while flies cover the room. Imagine sleeping while insects gather near every source of warmth. Imagine trying to work while clouds of tiny creatures surround your face every minute of the day. It would feel endless. And fear was spreading almost as quickly as the insects themselves because people were beginning to notice something else. Animals were becoming sick. At first, a few livestock appeared weak. Farmers noticed cattle behaving strangely. Goats refused food. Sheep lay down and did not stand again. Horses appeared exhausted without explanation. Egypt depended heavily on animals. Livestock meant food, transport, labor, farming power, wealth. Families measured security partly through animals. A healthy herd meant stability. Sick animals meant uncertainty. Dead animals meant disaster. Soon rumors spread across villages that strange illnesses were moving through herds. People who owned cattle began watching them constantly. Farmers spoke quietly among themselves. Merchants traveling between settlements carried stories from other regions. Entire herds becoming weak. Animals collapsing suddenly. Strange symptoms appearing, and then death arriving quickly afterward. Nobody knew exactly what was happening because each village only saw part of the picture. One family saw dead goats. Another heard about sick cattle several miles away. Another heard of horses dying unexpectedly. Gradually, people began realizing this was not isolated bad luck. Something larger was happening across Egypt itself. The problem with disasters is that they rarely stay in one place. Once something begins moving through systems people depend upon, stopping it becomes almost impossible. And ancient societies depended on systems more fragile than many realize. Remove one piece and the consequences spread outward rapidly. Sick animals meant reduced farming. Reduced farming meant fear about future harvests. Fear about harvests meant uncertainty in markets. Prices changed. Supplies became unstable. Anxiety spread. Even those who had not yet experienced losses began worrying because everyone understood a basic truth. If enough animals die, eventually people suffer too. Then the illnesses reached humans. Small symptoms first, skin irritations, strange sores, painful swellings appearing on arms and legs. Some people developed fevers, others complained of weakness. Entire families worried about symptoms they had never seen before. Priests attempted treatments using oils and herbs. Healers offered remedies. Some worked perhaps. Others probably did not. Ancient medicine understood many things surprisingly well, but it could not explain diseases spreading through disrupted ecosystems. So people looked elsewhere for explanations. They looked toward the gods. Egypt had many gods connected to natural forces. Gods of rivers, skies, health, fertility, order. Egyptians believed balance held the world together. They called this balance Ma'at, the natural harmony keeping existence itself functioning correctly. And now balance seemed to be collapsing. Rivers behaved strangely. Animals fled. Insects multiplied. Livestock died. Illness spread. The world no longer felt ordered. It felt broken. Imagine living through that without understanding environmental science or disease transmission. Imagine seeing your entire reality change week by week while every explanation you trusted begins failing. People prayed harder. Offerings increased. Temples became crowded. Families asked priests questions no one could answer. Why is this happening? How long will it continue? What have we done wrong? The frightening part was not merely the suffering. The frightening part was uncertainty. Human beings tolerate hardship surprisingly well when they believe hardship will end. But uncertainty creates something heavier. People begin imagining worse possibilities. They begin expecting disaster around every corner. And perhaps that was exactly what Egypt was beginning to feel. Because by now the strange events had evolved beyond inconvenience. This was no longer about frogs or insects. Egypt itself was beginning to weaken. The systems holding daily life together were starting to crack. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another disaster was already moving closer. One that would strike not only people and animals, but the fields themselves, the crops, the food, the very future of Egypt. Continues as Egypt now stood in a place that every civilization secretly fears reaching. The moment where people stop asking whether things are getting worse and begin asking how much worse they still can become. Because until now, most of the disasters had attacked comfort, health, and stability. Life had become difficult, frightening, exhausting. But the next events threatened something even more dangerous: survival itself. Across the Nile Valley, farmers looked toward their fields with growing unease. Crops were supposed to represent certainty. Seeds became plants, plants became food, and food became tomorrow. That cycle felt dependable. It had repeated through generations so consistently that most people probably never imagined it could fail completely. But nature does not always care about expectation. One afternoon, strange clouds began appearing over the horizon. At first, they looked harmless, distant masses forming where sky touched land. Farmers noticed them while working, but continued with their tasks because storms were not unknown in Egypt. Unusual, perhaps, but not impossible. Then winds started changing. Air moved differently. Dust lifted from roads and fields. Birds behaved strangely. Some flew lower than usual. Others disappeared entirely. Animals grew restless again. Horses shifted nervously. Cattle made uneasy sounds. Dogs barked without clear reason. Human beings have always possessed a strange instinct around changing weather. Long before technology existed, people often sensed when something felt wrong. And now, something definitely felt wrong. The sky darkened gradually. Winds strengthened. Dust moved across fields in spinning shapes. Families standing outside watched the horizon carefully. Children who normally played in open spaces were called inside homes. Merchants packed belongings more quickly than usual. The atmosphere itself seemed heavy, almost waiting. Then the storm arrived. Not ordinary rain, not ordinary wind. The kind of storm people remember for decades afterward because ordinary words suddenly stopped feeling large enough. Violent winds swept across the land. Hail began falling from the sky with terrifying force. Ancient texts describe hail mixed with fire. And while historians debate exactly what that meant, imagine how ancient people must have experienced it. Lightning tearing across dark skies while frozen stones crashed into crops and buildings. To people with no scientific explanation, it must have looked like the heavens themselves had become angry. Farmers watched helplessly as months of labor disappeared within minutes. Plants bent and snapped beneath impacts. Trees lost branches. Storage areas suffered damage. Animals caught outside struggled against conditions they could not escape. Entire fields that represented future harvests were destroyed. And storms create a particular kind of fear because, unlike disease or drought, there is absolutely nothing you can do except wait and watch. Human beings dislike helplessness, perhaps more than suffering itself. Watching destruction happen while being unable to stop it creates a different kind of terror. By morning, people stepped outside into silence. Fields looked ruined. Pieces of crops lay scattered across the ground. Trees stood damaged and broken. Farmers walked slowly through areas where green life had existed the previous day. Some simply stared without speaking, because there are moments where language becomes too small for reality. Egypt had survived many hardships through history, but agriculture was survival. Crops meant food. Food meant life. Destroy enough harvest, and every other problem becomes worse immediately. But nature still was not finished, because disasters have a habit of arriving together. Damaged fields create opportunities for new problems. And soon, another movement appeared along distant skies. At first, people probably mistook it for smoke or strange clouds moving low across the horizon. But these clouds moved differently. They shifted with strange patterns. They seemed alive somehow. Gradually, details became visible, and fear spread quickly through villages and farms because people realized they were not looking at weather. They were looking at locusts. Countless locusts. Huge moving masses darkening sections of sky itself. Ancient farmers knew exactly what locusts meant because locust swarms had terrified agricultural societies for thousands of years. A storm destroys crops accidentally. Locusts destroy what survives afterward. The insects descended onto damaged land in enormous numbers. They covered plants, fields, trees, gardens, anything green. Leaves disappeared rapidly. Remaining crops vanished. Whatever the storm had spared now faced destruction from millions upon millions of hungry mouths. Imagine hearing them before seeing them completely. The sound of endless wings moving together like distant rain. Imagine standing helplessly while food for entire communities disappears before your eyes. Because that is what locusts represented. Not annoyance, not inconvenience, hunger, real hunger. Fear now changed across Egypt. Earlier disasters created confusion and anxiety. This created something deeper. People began imagining futures without enough food. Parents worried quietly while children listened from nearby rooms. Merchants worried about shortages. Officials worried about supplies. Priests worried because frightened populations often turned toward gods asking difficult questions. The world around them no longer felt predictable. Rivers changed. Animals died. Illness spread. Storms destroyed fields. Locusts consumed what remained. Ancient Egyptians believed order held reality together, and now reality itself seemed increasingly unstable. Then something even stranger happened. After storms and destruction, after insects and sickness, after fear had already settled into every corner of life, darkness arrived. Not ordinary night, something else. Something people would remember because it felt unnatural. Ancient texts described darkness covering Egypt for 3 days. A darkness so thick people struggled to move, work, or even understand what surrounded them. Historians today debate possibilities: massive sandstorms, volcanic activity somewhere far away affecting skies, dense atmospheric conditions. But imagine experiencing it without modern knowledge. Imagine waking and seeing almost nothing. Imagine waiting for sunlight that never fully arrives. People who had already survived weeks of disasters now sat inside homes, wondering whether light itself had abandoned them. And perhaps by that point, the most frightening thought in Egypt was no longer asking what disaster comes next. The most frightening thought was wondering whether normal life would ever return at all. And now we arrive at the final chapter of the story, the point where fear had moved beyond markets and fields and animals and settled into something far more personal. Because civilizations can survive damaged crops. They can survive storms, disease, even years of hardship. But what people struggle to survive is the feeling that the world itself has become unpredictable. Egypt had already endured river changes, swarms of creatures, sickness, dying livestock, shattered harvests, locust invasions, and days of darkness that must have felt endless. By now, every ordinary Egyptian likely woke each morning wondering not whether something strange would happen, but what strange thing would happen next. Imagine living with that kind of uncertainty. Imagine parents watching their children sleep and silently hoping tomorrow would simply be normal. Imagine priests standing inside temples offering prayers while privately wondering why no answers seem to come. Imagine officials trying to reassure people while not feeling reassured themselves. Because fear spreads differently than disease. Disease attacks bodies. Fear attacks certainty. And certainty is what civilizations quietly depend on. Then comes the final plague described in Exodus, the most mysterious and emotionally devastating event of all, the death of the firstborn. Unlike the previous,